Hello, everyone. This is Spiritual Formation, and we're looking at the book of Philippians tonight. We're going to actually dive into the book. Last time we met and you watched one of these videos, we talked about how the church was planted. Tonight, we're going to actually get into the nitty-gritty of the letter that Paul writes to the Philippians. And this is a letter that Paul writes from prison. If you remember back to the last video, we saw that Paul actually entered prison, and that's kind of how the church got planted. Is the Philippian jailer got saved, his family got saved, and that's kind of how this church got started. Well, it's kind of a similar theme when Paul writes this letter, because he is writing it from prison. A member of the Philippian church had come to strengthen Paul and bring him some resources and things like that so that he could continue on in his ministry, brought him some gifts and things like that. And so this book begins with an opening prayer of thanksgiving for the Philippians, because they are giving to Paul out of their lack. They are kind of the anti-Corinthian church. If you remember back a few weeks ago to when we looked at 1st and 2nd Corinthians, one of the things that Paul rebukes them for is their forgotten generosity, that although they had a rich abundance, they were not willing to give anything. Well, the Philippians are not poor by any stretch, but they are not as well off as the Corinthians, and yet here they are giving time and resources. In fact, the guy who would bring him these things while he was in prison, a guy named Epaphroditus, he would actually get so sick. He caught some type of bacteria or disease or flu or something like that while he was bringing this stuff to Paul in prison, that he actually almost died because of it. And so that just served as a further testimony to Paul of the generosity of these Philippians. And so he begins this letter with a prayer of thanksgiving for them and how he's thankful for them. And then he goes on to give them a bit of a rundown on his outlook on things that are going on. Really, if you were to look at the main theme of this book, it would be all about joy in the midst of your circumstances, because when we have joy and when we endure sufferings joyfully, we're actually living like Jesus. And so Paul is counting to the Philippians some of the joys about his imprisonment. And one of the things that he brags on is actually one of my favorite things that Paul ever says, that because of his imprisonment, the gospel has been able to advance throughout the entire Roman guard. So this is what Paul means by that. When he is in prison, that means that, every 8 hours a day, the guard changes, meaning that somebody's job shift ends for the day. A guard, his job shift ends, and so he gets to go home, and then a new guard comes in. And then 8 hours later, another guard circles in and out. And so these guards are constantly having to sit there and listen to Paul preach the gospel to them while he's in prison. They're literally a captive audience. The problem is Paul's the captive and they are the captors, but in the grand scheme of things, he's the one getting the last laugh because he's sharing the gospel with them. And in all likelihood, some of them may have come to faith and gotten saved through it. But Paul is also telling them this, that, the fact of the matter is he may be executed. And that's okay with him, because for him to live is Christ and to die is gain. For him to live means that he is going to go on every day ministering the gospel in the same way, that it's a positive if he gets to go on living, because there's just more work to be done. That shows that God's not done with him yet, and that more can be accomplished for the name and sake of the gospel. But it also means this, that if he's executed, that's a gain. It's actually better than to live, because he's going to get to go home and to be in glory and to put away the sufferings of the present time. And so for him, like he says, to live is Christ, to die is gain. If he lives, great, he gets to minister. If he dies, even better, because he gets to go home and be with Jesus and put everything to rest. But he also says this, that in our sufferings, which is what we should expect as Christians, that affliction and suffering is something that we, we're free to look to avoid it, but we shouldn't believe that that's, our ultimate hope. We should endure sufferings because of this. Jesus was the one who endured suffering for us. And when we endure sufferings, it makes us more like Jesus. So Paul kind of breaks away from his main thesis here in talking about thanksgiving and enjoying these circumstances, to go into what we call the Messiah poem of Philippians. In chapter 2, verses 6 through 11, he's going to give one of his most famous chunks of passages out of all of the letters that he writes, and it's this Messiah poem where it talks about how Jesus didn't count equality with God something to be grasped. Instead, he emptied himself. Jesus, as Paul says in the book of Romans, is the new and better Adam, where Adam was the first person made, and he was our representative on earth. He's the one who passed down his sin nature to us. When Adam chose to eat the fruit, he was doing it in a self-centered and prideful way. He was making a choice to follow in pride and be self-serving rather than serve others. Jesus, on the other hand, is the new and better Adam. I'm sure that you can hear my son crying in the background, so please excuse that. But Jesus is the new and better Adam. Jesus is the one who would endure suffering on our behalf, that he didn't count the joy and comfort of heaven to be something that he held on to tightly, that he was willing to let go of it and forfeit his godness in a sense, although Jesus is fully God and fully man when he walks the earth. In a way, it was like he was forfeiting his comfort as the divine in order to become the suffering servant on our behalf. And so when we suffer, we become more like Jesus, and that it's a sanctifying process. And it says, it finishes out the poem, and it says, being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So Paul is saying that when we refuse to exalt ourselves, when instead we choose humility like Jesus did, in the end, in a way, we will be exalted because we will be exalted to praise Jesus as the King of Kings on the last day. Here's a fact of the matter, guys. No matter who you are, no matter what you do, no matter what your belief system is, if Christianity is right, and we obviously believe that it is, then in the end, even the people who shook their fist at God for their entire lives, the worst of the worst, the atheists who never wanted to give God any credit, people who were vile in the way that they live their lives and things like that, even they will be forced to bow to Jesus in the end. But we who humbled ourselves on earth and chose to be self-giving rather than self-serving, we will be exalted to live with him in heaven and glorify him for all of eternity. Yes, every knee will bow and every tongue confess, but not everybody will be saved. And that's kind of how this Messiah poem ends out, is that every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory of God the Father, that through his suffering, he became not just the suffering servant, but the exalted Messiah. Paul is going to transition from there to the end of the letter, and he's going to give two examples of people who live this cruciform way of life, this self-giving way of life, and that's his protege Timothy. Timothy was like a son to Paul. In fact, the books of 1st and 2nd Timothy kind of serve as Paul's last will and testament. They're kind of his last words, his the last things that he writes before he is executed in Rome. Are these passages to Timothy, these encouragements to Timothy. He considered Timothy to be his son in the faith. But Timothy was a very self-giving man, that he sought the needs of others ahead of his own needs. And the second guy that he's going to talk about is this guy Epaphroditus, who, as I said earlier, was so willing to put himself aside that he actually got really sick when he delivered this stuff to Paul, these encouragements and resources and money and things like that. And it almost killed him. It didn't, but Paul is going to brag on him and talk about how he's a very selfless individual to give himself in that manner. From there, Paul is going to finish out the letter, and he's going to talk about his own example, about his past, and how he had all of this rich life in Judaism. He was kind of a cultural elite. He was the best of the best, a Pharisee of Pharisees, as he says in 2 Corinthians. But how he had to give all of that up in order to know the risen Jesus. And so he's going to talk about his example and how our true citizenship is not on earth where, we can acquire wealth and nice possessions and things like that. Instead, our citizenship is in heaven. And so we need to be emptying ourselves of pride and vanity and things like that, and keep in the forefront of our minds that our citizenship is not here, it is in heaven. And so he gives us a challenge to live out the example of Christ and he gives this closing prayer of thanks. And in this closing prayer, that's where you get the most famous, maybe, verse of all, for a lot of people, Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now, this is not for the athletically gifted or the musician or something like that thinks, oh, just because I believe in God, he's going to take care of me and give me exactly what I want, when I need it. That's not at all what he's saying. God will take care of you, but what Paul is ultimately saying here is, I know the secret to living a life of prosperity. The life of prosperity is a mental prosperity. I have my mind set on my citizenship in heaven, and it's because of that confidence, because of the gospel, because I know where my eternal heritage lies, where my eternal destination resides, that I can be joyful and content and joyous in all circumstances, because I know what God says about me, and that's all that I need. So if I am in sickness or if I am in health, whatever I am enduring, I know the secret to life. It's to fix my eyes on the gospel and trust in the God who can save me and has saved me and promised me a future of eternity with him. Again, to live as Christ and to die as gain. So that's how Paul finishes out the letter. Philippians is one of my favorite books of the New Testament, although it's one of the shortest letters. It's definitely one of the most jam-packed. If you ask me, the Messiah poem in chapter 2 and verses 6 through 11 is maybe one of the best renditions of the gospel that's given to us in a very short, little snippet here. It's so packed with gospel that if you could memorize that, that would be an easy way to share the gospel with people. So anyways, I hope that you got a lot out of this. I hope that you enjoyed it. Your quiz will actually be posted on Friday this week. I had on Google Classroom and on your lesson plans that it would go up on Thursday. It's actually going to go on Friday. So I apologize for that. We have been car shopping like crazy. And so it's served as a bit of a distraction to me. And so I apologize for that. But because of that, I'm going to extend your quiz date by a day. You'll only have one quiz left this week, and you'll be done from there. So anyways, hope you have a great week, and miss you guys, love you guys, and hope that you're doing well.